host, CEO, and founder of Teens Uncharted. I'm also a mental health specialist specializing in the treatment of teenagers. They're my favorite people. They're my lifeblood. They're my whole practice. So I want to give you all of the things that I know that I talk about with my clients, with the families. So I hope you were here to listen. Today, we are actually going to do a deep dive into some coping skill stuff because coping skills are one of the obviously very helpful things about life that we should all learn. But there are ways to use them and ways not to use them. And we are going to talk about it today. So this episode is particularly for providers who feel like they're just throwing coping skills at teens and nothing sticks. And it's also for parents who have ever told your kid, just remind them to use their coping skills, right? So we are also going to talk about providers who feel like that pressure to teach skills when you see them all fall flat. And we're actually going to talk too about the tie-in with DBT and what I kind of see from that lens. So this episode is going to cover what coping skills actually are, how to use them and how not to, what they are not, how high-risk teens often experience coping skills, coping skill burnout, and why just use your skills backfires. So we are told that coping skills fix everything, but it's not that simple. So ground rules for today. This is obviously for educational purposes. This is not therapy or crisis support. I encourage you to listen and take with you what is helpful. And then if you need any help or resources, connect with some local supports, especially if you're worried about your teen's safety. All right, we're going to jump right in because I have so many things to say about this topic. So first off, I think there is a lot of confusion in the world about what a coping skill is. So the simple definition is that a coping skill is any strategy that someone uses to manage big internal experiences, thoughts, emotions, body sensation, urges. That means that when we think about the gamut of human behavior and the gamut of human experience, anything can be a coping skill. That is a hill I will die on. We use coping skills to help us survive a tough moment. We use them to get through a feeling or to move closer towards our values. And coping skills can fall into kind of like three different categories. We have the short-term, soothing, regulation, distraction, sensory tools, breathing. We have the meaning-making ones, the problem-solving ones, so values work, boundaries, communication. And then we have support seeking, which is reaching out to people using systems. I'm sure that as we go, you'll probably hear me talk about the toolbox. Small caveat, when I was in grad school, everyone always said, you have to have a lot of tools in your toolbox to help manage like different things. Freaking hated that analogy. I hated it so bad because it just felt so generic. But if we're going to take that concept and apply it, I do think it's really true. When we're talking about coping skills, we can't have just one coping skill, right? One coping skill is not going to kind of run the full human experience and help us through every single thing that we are likely going to go through in our entire lives, right? That's why learning new hobbies, learning new habits, learning new skills and whatever is just going to help add to wellness and overall life. So I will not use that phrase here in terms of the toolbox, but I know a lot of providers use it. And if you work with teens and you've ever used that, you've probably also gotten the like, go F yourself. That's freaking stupid. I don't want to talk about that. Reply, this podcast is for you. Or if you're a parent and you've had that said to you, kids do that too. So I want to talk quickly. The goal of coping, right? The goal of coping is to reduce intensity enough to make safer and wiser choices, right? So when we're talking about, Katie was on my podcast a couple weeks ago, and we talked about how the hospital becomes the coping skill, right? And when we think about high-risk kids, that is so true because we're literally trying to contain them so that we can get them to a point where we can make safe and healthy and wise choices and not impulsive ones that are risking their safety and self-preservation, right? So for some people, hospitalization can be a coping skill. Just like for other people, going to church a ton every week and really committing to that and living everything you do through Christ or whatever the God is can also be a coping skill. So we are not trying to make feelings disappear or to make kids easy or compliant. I will just put that out there because at the end of the day, a coping skill is not for us as adults. It is not to make our life easier. It's not to make a situation easier for us, right? We're not trying to like force compliance with coping skills or practicing coping skills. We are literally trying to help regulate that teen's internal state, right? That is the true purpose of a coping skill. So I want to talk quickly about what coping skills are not, because I think that even I had posted on my Instagram, if anyone wants to like follow, subscribe there, I post a lot of content. Even on my Instagram, someone had posted and said that their kid was saying that drinking Monster energy drinks with their pills in the morning was a coping skill. And at the time, I was like, I don't really see that as like a coping skill. I see that more as like a behavioral choice, but I don't know the kid and I don't know kind of where this person is at on a daily basis. And so I can't say that that's not a coping skill, but I think understanding the intention behind it and having that conversation would be really important. So anything is a coping skill, but what coping skills are not is they're not a magic off switch for hard feelings. So just because your kid uses a coping skill or just because you teach your client a coping skill doesn't mean that that feeling is all of a sudden going to go away. And I do think that when we teach kids coping skills and we teach teens coping skills, they have this like understanding or like there's this like assumption that because we're asking them to use a coping skill that all of a sudden everything is going to be gone. They're going to feel totally fine. They're going to bounce back. They're going to be able to go to school, whatever that thing is. But really, that's not the case. We just want to help their internal state regulate enough so that we can have whatever conversation we need to have and figure out a way forward in a safe and healthy way. Coping skills are not a punishment. Okay? So if you have a teen who's being disruptive, who's having a hard time, who's dysregulated, the statement a lot of teens will get is go use your skills because you're too much, right? And imagine feeling such heavy things. Imagine feeling so out of control. Imagine feeling like nobody is hearing you. And then that is what's said, either by a parent, a professional, a teacher, a cop, whatever you want to say, right? Go use your skills and come back less. That's not the message we want to send, especially when we're talking about coping skills. Coping skills are not a way to avoid all discomfort. You can cope your way through things, but it does not mean that you're not going to have to learn to tolerate discomfort when it's appropriate and healthy and safe. Coping skills are not a stand-in for safety planning, treatment, or any sort of work with the school system, trauma, etc., right? We are not saying that coping skills are like the be-all, end-all fix for everything. They are merely a small part of the process. So if you are someone who works with teens or you want to work with teens and the first session you're trying to teach coping skills, you have just lost that client, right? We need to take time to really understand the people that we're working with, to understand the teens in order to truly apply coping skills that are healthy, safe, and effective for that person. Given that we all have different sensory profiles, we all have different sensory needs, we all have different perceptions and orientations and lenses and perspectives. So if we're slapping a coping skill on something and we haven't fully explored and figured out what are we even coping with and why are we coping with it and why is it hard, then we truly don't understand what we're prescribing in that moment if we're trying to say, use this skill. The other thing I'll say is that coping skills are not behavioral control tools for adults. They're not a thing to turn a kid off. They're not a thing to send a kid away. These are for the teen's nervous system, not the adult's convenience. They're also not instant, right? Just the same way that you would go through physical therapy for an injury or you would go through surgery and then recovery periods, it's the same way with mental health. Coping skills require repetition before they're truly useful. And oftentimes that repetition is the most helpful when the person is not in crisis, which is why when we talk about preservation, we talk about, wholeness and wellness and safety, we can look at all of these different pieces in terms of what sports do they have, what activities do they have, what hobbies they have, because these are things that they've already practiced. These are literal coping skills that they have already practiced, that are in their repertoire, that are in their brain, that their brain is wired for. Those are things that we can use for coping. But we don't want to tell them, hey, if you're having a hard day, go shoot hoops, right? As an adult, as a provider, as a teacher, as a whatever, go shoot hoops with them, right? Like, there's a huge part of connection, even if you're not talking about the thing. So many teens get turned off by the idea of coping skills because what does it do? Go use your coping skills. It literally cuts off the connection they're having with another human when they're struggling and may actually want you to be around and be supportive. So go shoot hoops with your kids. Go shoot hoops with your teens. Go do those activities with them so that when they're having a bad day, it's not like, I'm punishing you and you have to go do your thing. It's like, hey, I know. Let's go shoot some hoops. We will feel better after and we can talk about it. So the other thing I'll say, when I mentioned this a little bit before, coping skills is not a replacement for safety planning. It's not a replacement for support and attachment. And it's not a replacement for addressing any sort of like trauma, oppression, family dynamics, etc. These are literally just a slice of the pie, and all these other pieces have to play into that as well. Using coping skills in the right way can be super helpful, but it's not, again, going to address the whole picture. Okay, for example, if a teen is in an unsafe home, no amount of deep breathing is going to fix the reality of the environment. So coping skills, again, very small part of that. We want to make sure we're addressing the entire pie. The thing I want to talk about next, and I had mentioned this briefly before, is that when you're talking about coping skills, and you're talking about coping skills as a provider, you're talking about them as a teen, as a guidance counselor, as whoever you are to that teenager, we really need to match the skill to the need. So, for instance, you would not try to like go make someone run a mile if they're really hungry. You would feed them. You wouldn't, make them change their clothes if they like hadn't showered in a week. You wouldn't like buy them a new chair for their room if their sheets on their bed need replaced. There are things that feel very logical, and when we spend the time and really dig into like what the need is, we then can effectively match coping skills with that need, which at the end of the day is going to make everyone feel better. So, for instance, if someone is feeling really like overwhelmed, for them, that might be grounding, it might be sensory stuff, it might be breathing, right? A lot of kids don't buy into any of those pieces because they find them boring or stupid, or they're like a baby, or you're telling them to control themselves, which is not the piece at all. If a client is feeling, or a teen is feeling lonely, we want to meet them with connection skills. Which is why if you have a kid who's having a bad day or they're really struggling, sending them away to practice their coping skills literally might be the worst thing that we can recommend. We really want to understand what that need is before we try to match it with the skill, because otherwise they could actually be super mishmashed. So the thing that I'll talk about too is, because I had said anything can be a coping skill, and that we often have high-risk teens that are using self-injury, they're using, eating disordered behaviors, they're using high-risk substance use, they're using impulsive like sex practices, they're using, speeding and being out until 2 o'clock in the morning and not doing their homework and all those other pieces. Those could actually be coping skills for that person. We want to make it so that we can understand the full gamut of how someone is coping without demonizing anything, right? If we demonize the situation or the coping skill, they're going to shut down. They're not going to talk to us about it, right? But we really need to be neutral and open to all of the things that they're navigating and all of the things that they're using in order for us to like help them focus on the things that maybe are a little bit more helpful for them or a little bit more like positive in their life that aren't having negative impacts. And so when you're talking about coping skills and you're assessing a teen, I would ask them about all of those things, right? Do you ever vomit? Do you ever binge? Do you ever self-harm? Do you ever cut? Do you burn? Do you break? Do you, skin picking, any of those pieces? What are those and how are they present for you? The other thing I'll say, which I think is really interesting, and this is my own perspective, is I know that self-injury only exists in one space in the DSM, and it's under borderline. And so it's really hard because a lot of kids that come in that are cutting get the diagnosis of borderline, when in reality they're trying to cope in the only way that they might know how, or the only way that they found that's worked for them. And it feels very unfair to slap a borderline label on someone before like truly getting to know them just because they're self-harming. So we want to like understand and assess for the full range of coping skills so that we truly understand where they're at with it, and then we can offer some suggestions, some solutions, some connection, any of those pieces. It's also really helpful if some of the coping skills integrate into what they're already doing and really focusing on the things that they're interested in or motivated by, because it's going to be that much better. So for instance, if you have someone who doesn't want to sit and do a mindfulness activity, they don't want to sit and meditate, they might really benefit from a walking meditation. They might benefit from hiking. They might benefit from running. They might benefit from like doing that stuff while mindful. I want to talk about the relational piece in terms of coping skills, because I know that there's, a lot of kids are in therapy. They have these things they're working on with their therapist, but there's a huge relational piece in terms of coping skills. And I do think that parents and providers should be invested in not just like telling kids to practice certain things, but actively doing it with them, which is part of why when we're in session and we're creating a PowerPoint, or we're listening to music, or we're dissecting or analyzing something, like that is a really great skill, and we're doing it together. We're building positive associations with that skill so that it feels accessible for them in the future. And when adults take that time and we offer co-regulation, right? You have someone borrowing your nervous system. So if your teen is dysregulated and they're borrowing your nervous system, you're literally saying, hey, I got you. Let's do this together. The validation in that is, yep, this is really hard, and we're going to do it together. So the thing we don't want to do is we don't want to say, go to your room and use your coping skill. We want to sit with them. We want to be in it with them. We want to teach them how to co-regulate. We want to teach them how to work through hard things. It's that day that they are in crisis is the longest day they've ever been on this planet. Same with you. Longest day you've ever been on the planet. And we need to do a better job at teaching our kids how to self-regulate and how to like work through hard things and how to sit with all those emotions. But we can't expect them to do that on their own, alone, all the time. It's great when they can independently practice it, but the goal for initially starting coping skills is not that they can do it by themselves. It's that they're open to doing it with us and then practicing it with us as we go, and then maybe taking that step into using it independently because it's something that they know feels good for them. So the thing I want to address too is when we're talking about high-risk teens, which is my entire population, they often have been through various hospitalizations. They've been through different levels of care. They've been through lots of different therapists. Sometimes by the time they reach me, likely you guys similar. And I think that coping skills in so many ways has been misused that they already have a bad impression of what that is. So part of your work with a high-risk teen might actually be helping them reprogram and reorient themselves into what a coping skill truly is and what it's not, right? So you can teach them the same things that this podcast is talking about so that they truly understand that it's there to be a helpful support. It's not there to erase that emotion or make them feel magically better, like everything is perfect. So for instance, like one of the common things I get is like, if we're talking about coping skills, they very much feel like somebody handed them a drawing pad and said to draw, and that all of a sudden it was going to fix their breakup with their partner, right? Or that someone was telling them to cope like they needed the direction like they were a baby. You want me to color when my life is falling apart? How dare you? But that's a true feeling, right? Like feelings are valid. They're just not always based in fact. And so we really want to create a conversation that allows for that openness and that awareness and engagement and not like shutting them down. The other thing that I love hearing from kids, from my teens, is like, Charity, if skills worked, I'd already be using them and I wouldn't need therapy. Right? And that's fair. It's so fair, right? Like if like certain weight loss things worked for us, we'd be using them. We wouldn't be in a nutrition's office, right? If our workout plan was working for us, we wouldn't be, meeting with a personal trainer. So those are all valid, and I think we can all find probably adult examples of how those things have like worked or not worked for us, but that just tells me that it's been misaligned. So coping skills in the past have been misaligned, and they haven't actually been addressing the things that you maybe went into therapy for, or the things that you were actually talking about when you were in that session or with your people. The other thing that I think happens a lot with kids that come in, especially kids that are high risk, kids that are cutting, purging, etc., is that they've been given skills as homework, not partnered with in terms of like let's work on this. Like I had said, the co-regulation piece. And I don't know a single teen these days who's like open and accepting of homework, right? As soon as they hear homework, they're like, fuck no, I don't want to do this. This is dumb. Because you paired it as homework. You gave them a skill for homework instead of truly partnering with them in their life and their family. So, for instance, if I have a hard session with someone and they're really struggling, we talk about some things that would be helpful. My follow-up, either through phone or through email or through the portal to my people, was like, hey, these are things we talked about. These are things that I would really love them to use that they had agreed upon using, right? We're looping the family in, we're engaging them and partnering with those skills, and we're making sure that everyone is in the position to be able to be ready and accepting and open to what those things are. The other thing that often happens with coping skills, especially with high-risk teens, is that skills are only offered after a crisis, during or after a crisis, right? Not when they're calm. And it's really hard to associate something that's only offered during a crisis as something that's like calming and supportive and whatever. So when we're offering coping skills, we don't want just to focus on, oh, well, they're not in crisis, they don't need them right now, right? That's a broken mentality. We want to be offering these things as we go for the highs, the lows, the in-betweens, the saddies, the whatever, so that they can really understand and play with those pieces when their brain isn't on fire. The other thing that often happens with my high-risk teens is that they'll go to their parent and they'll be like, hey, or their therapist or their guidance counselor or whoever. They'll go to their parent and say, hey, I had a really shitty day. So-and-so did this and so-and-so whatever. And the response from the adult oftentimes is, did you try using your coping skills? Now, if that is a response that you get, if you're trying to share something with someone and that is like the person you really want to connect with in that moment, you are going to shut them the F down. And then there is no conversation. And then they just feel dismissed. Their emotions feel invalid. And why the heck would they want to use coping skills? Because now there's just a negative association with all of those things. So we want to reframe for parents and providers of teens and small children, right? Anyone really, even adults, I guess you could use this. We want to ask, what have they already tried, right? Where are they at in that system of thought? Where are they at in those feelings? We want to ask, what have they already tried? We want to validate that coping skills sometimes are not the thing that's going to be a magic switch and it's not just going to turn off the feelings, right? It could be helpful. It could help lessen that, but it's not going to erase it. Then you want to collaborate with them at the end of the day, and you want to help build different things that actually fits them and their needs, whether it's kind of in the moment or even after. But every crisis is an opportunity for future planning. So I want to talk quick too about the idea of using high-risk behaviors to cope, because I often think that kids come into treatment and their kind of understanding, assumption, expectation is that the adult in the room is going to say, absolutely not, you have to stop that, you can't do that anymore, right? You only care that I stop cutting, stop yelling, stop sleeping around, stop whatever, right? You don't actually care about why I'm hurting or what's happening for me. And when we lead with coping skills, we often get that pushback of like, you don't actually care, because we haven't spent the time to really understand what's underneath of them in order to, like, again, offer the coping skill that matches what they're looking for. We also do want to, like, normalize the experience that oftentimes I think high-risk kids are told to go practice their coping skills. They're told to, like, cope differently, they're cope whatever. Because a lot of the time, it's for, like, the adult's comfort, and it's not actually matching their own sense of pain and where they're at with it. So you can see why, even after just 20 minutes of chatting about this, when you talk about coping skills, a lot of kids are like, F that, that's dumb, I'm not doing it, stupid, whatever, right? There's already this resistance, but resistance is data, behavior is data, and we're looking at behavior and we're working on how do we get underneath of that iceberg so that it doesn't have to take down the Titanic, which is your kid. So the other thing I want to address here too is that coping skills need to fit the trauma, the neurodivergence, and they need to fit the system, right? So for instance, when we talk about having lots of different skills to cope with lots of different things, That is because if one of your skills is walking and going for a walk and being out in nature, but you're in the middle of a school day and you literally cannot leave the building, there's absolutely no way you're going to be able to use that skill in that moment, which is why having other skills like fidgets or drawing or deep breathing or listening to music would be really helpful, because that is an applicable skill that's appropriate for that environment. Skills can also be really invalidating when the teen is already living in like chaos or like an unsafe environment. Or for instance, when I used to work in residential, it was really hard to utilize coping skills when like the whole house was on fire and everyone was crazy and everyone was having a hard time and there were lots of like crises going on at the same time. We can only cope with so much, and I don't want anyone to think that coping skills are magically gonna make someone ignore the fact that there's like 7 kids fighting or there's a restraint happening or whatever. It's not gonna erase everything. It's literally just meant to support. Another thing when we're thinking about coping skills is that by the time a teen often gets to me, they are burnt out about coping skills, right? They don't care. They don't want to talk about it. They already know them. They roll their eyes. They're like, freak no, can we please do anything else? And I think that that is so valid given the fact that there are so many inpatients and partials and IOPs and stuff that fully only utilize a coping skill space, or they're not great maybe at going like deeper into all of that with kids. And so by the time teens get to therapy, they're like, I don't freaking want to do this. It didn't help me in the hospital. Why would I do it now? So the burnout from coping skills, the burnout from that like understanding is such a real thing. And sometimes what we need to do is we need to find a way around some of that, and we need to label it different things. So oftentimes nowadays when I'm talking with a teen about something, I don't even use the word coping skill, right? Because the second I say coping skill, flags go up and the knives come out and they're like, no, I'm not freaking talking about that. But they are actually coping. They are working through different things. So coping skills are present and they're happening, but I just can't call them that all the time with different people that I work with. So one of the reasons why I think burnout happens, aside from the prevalence of certain things in higher levels of care, is that like the same skills are repeated everywhere. So breathe, journal, go for a walk, color, draw, use ice, whatever. And a lot of times the skills are given and they're not even explained how or why they work. So there's no logic behind that, and there's no practice behind that, and the kid actually wasn't able to see any change from the start or end of that skill, and it's just like forced upon them. There are a lot of kids, especially kids who have experienced trauma, that literally cannot sit and do deep breathing, right? It is scary, it is unsafe, it does not feel good for their neurological system, which is why when we're pairing coping skills for a kid, we need to really take into mind their past traumas, their neurodivergence, any system involvement, so that we're not like re-triggering or making that skill feel unsafe. Eventually, with a kid who's experienced trauma, they might be able to sit and be mindful, but that may not be the space to start. So oftentimes when I'm working with a kid and we're trying to figure out kind of how they do their day and how they manage different emotions, I ask a lot about what they've previously been taught, learned, what's been helpful, what hasn't been helpful, because I want to be able to add in a lot of new skills. I want to be able to be super creative with those things. I want it to really fit where they're at in their life at this point. And now if you have someone, let's say who's 13 coming into therapy, oftentimes the skills they had when they were 7 or 8 aren't going to be the same. They're not going to be used in the same way. They're not going to have the same impact. And so it's time for an update. So update the coping skills, update the grid, update the menu of things that they have access to. And you can be crazy. You can put like fun, silly things in there. You can put stuff in there that's like, you know, they would only ever use like once in a while. That's one reason why I love this one journaling thing at Burn After Reading, because it essentially, you work through the journal and you destroy it as you go. And it really helps like you practice some of the things and see how it feels for you when it's done. So if we're not reflecting on coping skills after we used it, we're missing out on like half the process. So coping skill burnout often will look like, I've tried it doesn't work, they're rolling their eyes, they're doing the skill but feeling awful, so they lose a lot of hope. And we want them to truly feel like they can engage in coping skills in a way that works for them. So if a skill is offered without empathy, so just saying like, just do it, we're not creating a positive association. If we're offering them a skill that's way too hard for their current state of regulation, they're not going to have a positive association. If there's no follow-up or curiosity about why it didn't help or what their experience was, again, we're showing them that we don't actually care and it wasn't about them, it was about us. So thinking about coping skills, their emotional state matters. Just like you would if you were trying to like run a marathon, if you were trying to like have a big presentation, we know emotional state matters and it impacts those things. So when you're in a crisis, the thinking brain is offline, right? Our recall, our planning is a lot harder. We're much more focused on survival in the moment. So expecting a teen to remember like a long list of like potential coping skills is just like unrealistic for where they're at developmentally and what we know about kids in crisis. So when parents say things like, handle this alone, your feelings are a problem, that's how it's heard. If we say, just use your skills, that's interpreted as you're not trying hard enough. Your feelings are the problem to fix. I don't really want to hear the story. So instead of saying all of those things, we can work together to create more reflexive phrases in our own vocabulary for parents and for providers. So things to say instead are, can I be with you while we figure out what might help? Asking a direct question in terms of like, do you need comfort? Do you need a distraction? Do we need problem solving? What do you think could help you even just a little bit, right? What feels doable? Because again, we're not trying to wave a magic wand and replace the feeling and say that it doesn't exist and it's not happening. We want to just move the stick, just like 0.5 over, right? Into helping them feel a little bit better. So the role of adults, the role of providers, right, when we're talking about coping skills, we cannot leave it up to teens and tweens and younger kids to just like do these things on their own. The role of adults is to showcase and role model skills. It's to talk about crisis and emotional regulation. It's to practice those things in front of them. It's to welcome them in to practicing those pieces. It's to having discussions about what helps them when they're having a bad day or what helps them when they're feeling bad. And this, like, coping skills is often something that's built upon the foundation that they already have. And so if they don't have a foundation for this, we are building it piece by piece by piece. They're not going to get there overnight. They will get there over time, but we have to put the building blocks in place so that we're working with them and building the scaffolding that they can then eventually take and use for how they want to. So first thing for an adult, your co-regulation is going to be the most important piece. Do not send them away and tell them to go use their coping skills. We need to work on co-regulating. Eventually, we want them to be independent, but one of the first steps that you can do as an adult, as a provider, as whatever, is actually showcasing, like, we can do this, right? Let them borrow your nervous system. We will co-regulate with them. So the other piece that happens, and this is something I've seen a lot, is when we have a model that has been very helpful, that has shown a lot of like promise. Oftentimes there's this shift in the field where now everything is that model, right? It happened with DBT, it happened with IFS, it happened with all these other, components where it's like, it's the new it thing, right? And I appreciate DBT in a lot of different ways. I appreciate IFS. There's lots of different models and modalities that I really value, and I take from them what I can, and I leave the stuff that I don't find super helpful. But unfortunately with DBT, I think that it kind of got pushed into all these spaces and not used in a way that it was super helpful and actually reinforcing the fact that like you can feel better. And so what I've witnessed is that kids will go into inpatient, they'll go into partials, they'll have this higher level of care, and then it's just DBT focused skills, right? We're not doing the other part of the work. And then when a kid gets discharged, they're so sick of hearing about DBT skills that they want nothing to do with it. And then we actually have to start at square one and rebuild that entire situation so that they can actually understand what coping skills are. So this is not to say that DBT is bad. DBT can be a great model depending on the person. There's all these factors to consider. But when DBT is sectioned out like that and we're only given the coping skills, we have basically like cherry picked what we want to teach them or what we think is helpful without delivering the full model, and the full model is like therapy. If we're thinking about coping skills, again, it's only a small part of what that child, what that teen, what that like adult, right, needs to really function and to make progress. So if if we're only ever pushing skills, we're never going to make long-term improvements, and we're never going to kind of get there unless we're doing that deeper work. Oftentimes too, if places are pushing only a skills-based model, we're missing the philosophy, we're missing the structure, we're missing the support, we're missing all of the psych ed, we're missing all these pieces that are a part of it. So kids and teens, they don't freaking understand what we're asking them to do or why, and they think they're stupid, and that like none of those coping skills help. And then if they feel like none of the coping skills help, they feel hopeless. They feel hopeless. Life is never going to get better. They start to slide more like further down because it's a skill. It's a really easy skill, we tell them, right? But if we're saying it's a really easy skill and it's so hard for them because it's not matched up with something that's like a barrier for them, then we're literally reinforcing this idea of hopelessness. So think about that. Next time you're in working with a teen, you're in working with a kid, you're in working with an adult, right? I think this is so applicable to all areas. If we reinforce a skill and we say that this should be easy and then they cannot do it, we are literally reinforcing hopelessness. DBT out in the world, it's like literally everywhere. But the handouts and the language and the skills aren't enough to fully change someone's system, someone's family, someone's dynamic, someone's communication style, etc. And it's a problem because if we're not focusing on the entire model, we're not actually getting to those deeper pieces, right? So then teens feel like they're failing when they're actually not getting the full model and support, right? So we're teaching skills without understanding. Here, fix yourself. Here are skills that are going to make you feel like a magic human. We can totally reframe, and it's absolutely okay to take and borrow models from DBT, but we have to learn why the skill exists the way it does, right? As a provider, if you're giving someone a frozen orange, do you understand the psychology behind that? Do you understand the purpose of that skill? Do you understand what it's regulating, right? If you can't answer those questions, you need to go back to the drawing board and do some research on why that skill is offered. We want to validate them in their efforts, and using any kind of coping skill, even I'm not validating cutting, I'm not condoning cutting, but again, I would rather a kid like self-harm than kill themselves any day of the week. Because I can work on helping them get to a space where their coping skills are safer and healthier and they're making good decisions. Can't bring someone back from the dead. So I'd rather they cope in a way that's going to make sense for them. When we think specifically about, like high risk teens, if we're just giving skills without understanding where they're coming from, we're often going to have this vibe of like, here, fix yourself. And it's going to give this kind of false sense of like, oh, like you've done enough at this point, right? And again, we're not here, coping skills are not here to make the adults more comfortable. We're here to help the teen regulate their internal nervous system. So when we're talking high-risk teens, a lot of their stuff is around safety, attachment, collaboration, like sometimes medication, sometimes higher levels of care. We can't just throw a skill at that and say, hey, go like try tip again. Go dear man your way out of this, right? And again, not shaming DBT at all. DBT is wildly helpful and successful, but I think as a society we have taken the full philosophy and the full model, and we've essentially like diluted it down to just use your coping skills, and it makes everyone feel like they're not doing it right, or they can't be helped, or they're so far out because their skill isn't working, when in reality, again, coping skills are not just going to fix the problem. So I think for providers, like I had said before, one thing, if you are talking about coping skills and you have a teen or a family who's like utilizing those coping skills, one of the most important pieces after they have used a coping skill or like at the end of that week is to truly sit down and talk about what happened. What got in the way of them using a certain skill? What skill did they want to use? How was all of this like coming up for them? What did they feel in their bodies? Did they feel any better after they used said skill? Just the same way we talk about relapse, we want to always talk about like, what did we learn? What did we learn about using that coping skill? What do we want to learn going forward? What questions do we have about that coping skill or about like that situation or whatever? If we're not doing the work and reflecting and tying in perspectives that you have, perspectives that your client has, perspectives that maybe the family has, we're going to be that much less effective in our sessions if we're not getting that full feedback. The other thing that I'll talk about too is that when we think about coping skills, I do think there's this perception that like, oh, I'm going to practice this skill and then I'm going to feel, let's say 80% better, right? But when I talk about coping skills with teens, I want to know if it even was like a 1% increase, right? Like that could be just where you're starting at, right? Like did it move the needle 1%, right? 1% tells me something. If it went the other direction and made them feel worse, that tells me something. If it helped tremendously, that tells me something, right? We want to lean more into that area. But I don't want to focus on just the skills that helped 80% of the time. I want to focus on anything that helped move it in a better direction for that person. This is the other piece too that I think it's often let out in terms of teen therapy, is that if your teen is in therapy and working on, better, healthier, safer behaviors or like coping skills or whatever, you also want to be taught those skills, right? Because again, we are co-regulating with them. We are practicing these things. We are role modeling how to use different things. And if you do not know those things, it's going to be that much harder for you to help support your teen in them. One thing that I also love to recommend is sometimes if I teach a certain thing or we've talked about a certain like modality or skill, I will often email the parent and be like, hey, have so-and-so teach you this thing. Kids and teens love to be in the position of expert. So if they've learned the skill and they can teach it to their parents and then they can all practice, it feels like they're kind of evening the field between them and their parents, and they're able to actually bring something to the table and showcase something for them, which I think is huge for a lot of our teens. One thing too that I will always say in terms of coping skills is that keep a list. Have the parent keep a list, have the teen keep a list, like you keep a list. It's so helpful to be able to reference that with what works and what doesn't. And sometimes, like even as a provider, if I have 20 clients who are all working on different things, it's like hard to always remember what was the most helpful. And so if you're making yourself notes and you're creating a menu and you're writing all these things down, it's going to be that much more effective for you to be like, hey, remember that time that this thing worked and it worked really well for you. And then you're really making sure that you're following and you're having the reflection and the analytical brain to understand how all those things worked for them. And then if you have questions come up later in terms of school or accommodations or whatever, you have your entire list of things that you can put forth that are helpful. So in terms of suggestions for providers and for parents, build the shared coping menu. Write all those things down. Practice those skills when everyone is calm. So when you're in a session with a teen and they're like in a good space and calm, practice that skill. If you're at home with your kid and they're in a good mood, practice that skill. We can do so much more when people are calm and regulated than when we're in crisis, when the needs and the priorities are very different. When you are thinking that a coping skill might be helpful, you want to lead with connection, not with just go do a skill, right? So you are going to validate, you're going to reflect the feelings, you're going to offer to be there, and you can also you can craft a script with your provider or with your teen even of like what they feel like they might need or what would be helpful in that moment. So the other thing too, when we're talking teens and autonomy and independence, we want to respect their no. So if we're recommending a coping skill and we're just like trying to push that, if we think it'd be a great idea and they say no, respect that. Don't keep pushing, right? The more you push, the harder they're going to push against you, and you've just created a power struggle in like not a great time because they're not going to be able to regulate in the way that you'd want them to. So if they say no, let them know you're still there for them, and that you'll be around, that you can help them, right? That you are willing to be a helpful resource for them. So to recap, key points in this entire discussion, TLDR, right? Coping skills are tools, not cures. The skills must be practiced when calm, matched to the problem or the need, and embedded in the relationship and the environment. High-risk teens need more than go use your skills. They need safety, they need validation, and they need adults that will also work with them through that problem. Coping skills are super powerful when the philosophy and the structure are respected and incorporated into treatment. So again, if you are a therapist working with teens, don't throw coping skills. Like hands in the first session, we don't throw coping skills. We don't throw hands either. For parents, the one takeaway I would have is to like Pick one skill or hobby or routine that your teen really enjoys and make it a point to do that when you're not upset, when your kid's not upset, when they're not struggling, right? Just pick one thing. For providers, I want you to take a look at your last couple sessions with a client. Pick a client. Take a look at your last couple sessions and really take a look at, are you giving skills or are you building skill systems? Because I do think that is a really important piece for your reflection when you're working with teens. If you're just giving skills, again, not going to be as helpful as if we were actively building skill systems that worked, that were in place, that the kid was engaged in. So that is it for our podcast today, and I hope you learned some valuable takeaways around coping skills. Even if you have kids, don't have kids, work with kids, don't work with kids, I think that these are really valuable conversations that we can all have with each other, with our family, with our friends, etc. I would invite you to send questions or scenarios, anything that I could do like a Q&A on in terms of coping skills, or share this episode with a provider, share it with a friend, share it with a teen, share it with anyone you think it might be helpful for. The last thing I'll say for parents, if skills haven't worked the way you hoped, that doesn't mean that your teen is broken or that you failed. It means the plan needs to fit them better. For providers, you're allowed to question skills-only approaches and advocate for fuller models of care. You are not just a coping skill vault. You are also a human that has lots of good thoughts and feelings about the systems that we are a part of, and to encourage progression and growth within the field, we also need you to be a part of that. I will sign off for today. Thank you so much for listening. Again, my name is Charity Chaffee. I'm a teen mental health specialist, therapist, coach, consultant, and speaker. So if you have someone, an agency, program, etc., that you would like a speaker for, I'm delightful and very fun. But I'm around. Please hit me up with any questions.